right. Hi, my name is Carla Medrano, aka Moon the Storyteller, and I'm co-host of Ororo Comics podcast. I am a wife, a mom, a nurse, and a creator of Luna, the Queen of Maru, available right now through Concrete Comics.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Ebony Toussaint, and I'm a research scientist. And this is a safe space here at Ororo Comics Podcast, where we discuss the intersection of health, culture, and comic books. So joining us today, we have special guest, Dr. Qiana Whitted, to talk about her incredible career in academia and comic studies. So thank you for sharing your time with us. We are so glad you're here. Y'all hear me shout out the Nerdy South a lot, which is our comic book group. And Qiana is the mastermind who gathers us for all of the fun. And before I jump into her bio, for our listeners who may not know, comic studies is the academic study of comics and graphic novels, academic meaning institutions of higher learning, such as colleges and universities. So thank you so much again for being here, Qiana. So Dr. Qiana Whitted is a dear friend of mine and a professor of English and African American Studies at the University of South Carolina. She is the author of Eisner award-winning book, EC Comics, Race, Shock, and Social Protest, and editor of the volume, Desegregating Comics, Debating Blackness and the Golden Age of American Comics, which received the edited book prize from the Comic Studies Society. Her research and teaching focus on Black literary and cultural studies and American comics and graphic novels. Along with her published articles, book chapters, and online writings that explore race, genre, and history in comics, she has written the introductory essay for Marvel's new Penguin Classics collection of Black Panther comics. She's also served as editor of Inks, the Journal of the Comic Studies Society, and chair of the International Comic Arts Forum. Wow.
Welcome.
Wow. Welcome.
Such a rich not history, but a rich identity. I guess that's the word I want to say, because this is a part of you. Yeah.
Well, thank y'all for having me. I'm
Thank
a
you
big fan.
Who better to introduce everybody that listens to Ororo Comics Podcast to comic studies than you, Dr. Qiana Whitted. I couldn't think of any other person. I'm on and on about you all the time. I told you fangirling because it's so inspirational. And I'm not sure about you, Carla, but I did not know that comic studies was an area in academia. And I was like, Qiana, I changed my major from English at the University of South Carolina. I changed my major thrice. I was like, where were you when I was an undergrad and I was a McNair Scholar? I actually wrote my McNair Scholar projects on the Boondocks and the comic strips by Aaron McGruder.
Oh, I don't think I knew
So
that.
when I saw Dr. Sheena Howard, I think I saw the Boondocks in your office maybe, but when I saw Dr. Sheena Howard, I found her online. I was like, oh my God, she wrote her dissertation on the Boondocks. Where were these cool Black women, these cool people when I was undergrad and struggling and was like, okay, I gotta put aside the comic books and be a serious scientist. So.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, tell us about, your chosen degree programs and, your areas of specialization. I know you do 20th century African-American literature and culture and also American comics and graphic novels and Southern literature. So how did comic studies come about? Was this always a thing when you were pursuing your doctorate?
So no, it hasn't always been a thing. And I think the explanation that you just gave, the discussion of your own thesis project, is a good example of the fact that many people have been interested in this topic and studied this topic, but it hasn't always been institutionalized, right? So there have been folks like me and Dr. Howard and others at other universities who teach comics. I've been teaching it for, I guess it's 21 years now. But there haven't always been formal courses on the books or degree programs or departments or things like that. And that has been changing in the last 10 years. And so for you and others who are maybe like, where did this come from? That's kind of why people are able to sort of see and pay more attention now to that institutionalization, which has its benefits and drawbacks. But I was not trained initially in comic studies. My degree is in English and in African American studies. And initially, when I graduated and got my first job, which is still my current job at the University of South Carolina, it was to teach African American literature and American literature, some Southern literature. And I had a variety of interests. I had always been a comics fan, but like you, I wasn't sure how that would work with the scholarly projects that I was pursuing. And so around 2005, I had an undergraduate director who asked me to propose a summer class, something fun that would get students, energized and working over the summer. And so I proposed a comic studies class that focused mostly on Neil Gaiman's Sandman and mythology and the hero's journey and all those types of things. And it was doing the research for that class that I realized, sort of like you, that, hey, there are people who do this in the academy. There are conferences, there's a few journals. And so it sort of spiraled from there. And I can say more, but it kind of started to align with the work I was already doing in African American literature. And so that made it not easier to do, but it made it, I guess, palatable for my department chair and a nice way to work into my CV and my publications and the things that I was already doing.
Yes, the things that count for tenure.
That's right.
For those who may not know, in academia, activities may be fun and they may recruit students, but we're always thinking about how to quantify that impact on our dossier for tenure
Absolutely.
and promotion. It's like, does this podcast count? Does this, interview count? This op-ed? So all the things that we're counting towards our tenure clock.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure it wasn't easy because you mentioned 2005 and I'm just like, man, I still had a floppy disk case in
Yeah,
2005 for like my papers. And it was like one floppy disk per paper or something. And then that's when we slid papers under professors' doors or
that
something.
is right. Yeah.
So I'm sure searching and finding all these international conferences and you're like, whoa, wait a minute, people are studying this. What other programs or institutions do you think may have inspired your pitch to your director to say, hey, maybe, USC can do this as well?
Right. Well, so one of the first academic events that I involved myself in was the International Comic Arts Forum, which has been around for over 20 years. And I ended up sort of becoming the chair of that organization later. But they were among the first, and not the only, but among the first to sort of do a conference in the United States to talk about the academic study of conferences. And then there are places like University of Florida is a leader in this area. Um, uh, University of Oregon, Portland State. There are a few others, even Henderson University in Arkansas. There are little pockets of places where there are academics who are doing this work, but who are also in positions of power in that department or institution. And so you're a senior scholar in the English department and you want to pursue this, you can develop that more easily than, new junior scholars starting out. And so places like the University of Florida had a degree or a concentration, I can't remember, really early on. And now there's, a few dozen places across the country that do that. Typically, it's a minor or a concentration. Sometimes it's affiliated with an art school or an art program, but mostly it's English or communications where you see, or media studies where you see comics popping up more.
That's a great history lesson for me because like I was telling you before we started, I had no idea comic studies was a thing.
Yeah.
I was one of those people that went to college because I had to. And I think all of us went to college because we have to, but it sounds like you took your love for learning and turned that into align that with a passion that you had here over here, and you brought them both together and created this incredible program for those behind us to come in and learn. And I'm not I don't consider myself academic.
Mm,
So this next question is really, you know, something that I've been wanting to hear your answer on. So
sure.
you've been in academia for over 20 years. Can you share with us, well, you talked a little bit about, you know, in 2005, you had this opportunity to pitch this class. Um, but why did you choose American comics um, over other types of media to convey this to make literature more fun, more you also mentioned the word more palatable, but we'll talk about that. I think that's a whole nother show. But
Yeah.
well, why did you choose comic books to pitch to your academic superior, and why did you stick with that? Why did you write these books? Why did you decide to take on that editor role for the Desegregating comics? And then also, along with that, do you see yourself crossing over into Hollywood?
Oh. Okay, well,
I know that's a lot, but
no, that is a lot. I mean, that last question I can answer pretty quickly and say, not right now, not necessarily. But in terms of why comics, why this particular topic or medium, I mean, I think so. As I mentioned before, I've been a fan my whole life. Now, I haven't been knowledgeable and a fan of superhero comics my whole life. That did come later. But when I grew up, I was reading Garfield and Peanuts, a lot of newspaper comic strips. I loved Mad Magazine, humor, jokes, all that kind of stuff. And then I sort of switched to horror and fantasy as I got older, and that has sort of also come into my work. But I mean, the work that I also truly and deeply love is African American literature. So, I teach Toni Morrison and Richard Wright and James Baldwin, and some of the questions that they ask and the representations that they're interested in are the kinds that I love to explore and to teach. When it came to comics, like I said, I thought those two things would have to remain separate. And I didn't really think that the kinds of questions that I'm asking, for instance, about a novel like Beloved by Toni Morrison, would be relevant to a comic. But then, one of my favorites, I know this may be a question I'll ask later. One of my favorite comics is Swamp Thing, DC Comics Swamp Thing. And I love Alan Moore. I love his run on Swamp Thing. And the first article that I wrote in Comic Studies was about a story arc in Swamp Thing that takes place, because that story takes place in Louisiana, where Swamp Thing comes across a plantation where the buried slaves come back to life. And I mean, zombie slaves and swamps. I mean, that's pretty much everything I ever want in a in a story. And so notions of buried trauma, of the past coming back, of a blood-soaked earth, like those types of things that we talk about in Southern studies or in African American literature are also happening there too, but it's coming up through a whole different tradition of comic books and graphic novels. And of course, if you know Alan Moore, he's a British writer. So he is taking a different approach to some of those same issues that I might look at in Toni Morrison's work. And for me, it's just absolutely fun to be able to put that in conversation. So a lot of times what I'm doing is putting those works in conversation with the popular culture of the moment. And that includes my work on the 1950s that is discussed in my latest book as well. So, I mean, the last thing I would add is what I tell my students is that comics is another form of storytelling. I know that we think it's all Black Panther and Captain America, and it is, but it's a medium that can tell any story. And if there's anything you're interested in, there is a comic book, a graphic novel, a webtoon, there is something in that form that can tell that story. And for me, that opens it up, that world of narrative and visual narrative to analysis and exploration and all that kind of good stuff.
Before we jump into the next question, I just want to say James Gunn, back in January 2023, did announce that Swamp Thing is officially part of the DCU's Gods and Monsters chapter.
Oh,
So
is that right?
James Gunn, if you're listening, come and get you some Qiana.
Oh, good.
Because she can
Yeah.
add a layer of culture, and I think in some people's cases, faith, to that story, and I don't know if it's just going to be a series. I don't know if it's going to be a movie, but I feel like Black scholars in the comic book space can add a lot to what Hollywood is producing at this time. So that's why I asked that question. So
Sure.
just James Gunn, come and get you Qiana.
Okay.
Come and get her. Come and get her.
I think something else that you said is really important too, because I think, and we kind of talked about this in the Nerdy South a little bit, is when a lot of people think about comic books, it's like, oh, superheroes, like, oh, okay. And maybe that messaging doesn't appeal to everybody for whatever reason. So when you mention Richard Wright and Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, these may appeal to a lot of us, especially Black people who've studied English and who are writers, and things that how we've been able to consume stories and tell them in the way we process and engage. And so when you say that there's a comic book for that too,
Yeah.
and I'm even looking behind you, of course, at the omnibus on your shelf,
Yeah.
the bitter root, because
Bitter root, right.
oh my gosh, even your essay for the back matter. Of course, y'all know I love horror, and she started with Gullah Geechee folklore. So I was like, oh, more fangirling. This essay is the best essay ever because she mentions
Oh.
tags. But there's just so many different elements, like you said, when we're able to see ourselves represented and see, like you said, trauma buried, things coming back to the surface that we thought we buried. We saw that in Wakanda, they didn't know that they buried us, that we were seeds and like movements would grow. So I think it's interesting when you talk about it's another media for storytelling, and that we can see some of our authors and the way we discuss these critical topics. We can see that even in comic books and graphic novels. So I guess that'll take me into our next question. You won an Eisner Award. Can you tell us more about Eisner Award? Major, y'all. Eisner Award for Best Academic Work of 2020.
Just sorry to interrupt you. So Eisner Awards are like the Dr. Sheena Howard described. I was like, what is an Eisner Award? What is that? She said it's like an Academy Award of the comics. So
she's got one too.
Yes, she does. Yes. And we had another Eisner Award winner on the show as well. So Ororo Comics Podcast, y'all. We got some award-winning creators on here.
Only Eisners around here. So the Eisner Award for Best Academic Work in 2020, which recognized your exceptional and innovative scholarship for your book, EC Comics, Race, Shock, and Social Protest. So can you tell us more about this work or any other projects you want to discuss? We already kind of mentioned your newest project, Desegregating Comics, Debating Blackness and the Golden Age of American Comics. So tell us more about these works, which are incredible, just phenomenal. I think I bought like 5 or 6 copies of this already, and I've gifted it to so many people.
Oh. Well, so this kind of goes back a little bit to what I was saying before in terms of how the unexpected intersections between the different parts of my work. So I do really enjoy reading and teaching about Black literature during the 1950s, that mid-century period. And I was I'm trying to remember. Okay, I told this story so many times. Which class was it? It might have been a lit class or it might have been a comics class, but it was a student who had taken both with me. And he brought me a photocopied, just on Xerox copied version of a story by EC Comics that was called The Guilty, and it was about a Black man who had been accused of a crime he didn't commit and was later killed by the sheriff, right, after being like attacked with racial slurs. And I'm looking at this, and it's pretty explicit, and um, I'm like, well, who did this, and when did this come out? And I look and I see that it comes out in 1952. And I'm just like, oh, okay, 1952. The Black characters are realistically drawn. They don't look like minstrel figures. And the story is pretty blunt about the sort of unequal justice that African Americans face all across the country. So I'm thinking about 1952 and what else is important to me as a scholar during that period. And that's when Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man comes out, one of my favorite novels.
Yes.
And I was like, I teach this book and I teach comics, but I would never think of the two side by side.
Mm.
And when you look at those publications, they have entirely different audiences to some extent. They're written sort of with different approaches in mind. And, you know, there's so many things that are similar that are happening, but again, they're not often considered in the same orbit. So
Mhm.
um, I knew EC through Mad magazine. I mentioned Mad before already, and they published Mad. But I didn't realize that during the 50s, the late 40s and 50s, they had also produced what they called these shock comics or shock suspense stories. And so the book, just a long story short, the book is about what that company called the preachies, or these stories that used some of the elements of what they were most known for, which was actually horror, because EC produced Tales from the Crypt. A lot of people know Tales from the Crypt. They also did science fiction, crime comics. So they used those same traits and characteristics, but they used it to talk about contemporary social and political issues, religious intolerance, even sexual assault. Like they talked about all of these really urgent and important issues, and they did it in such a strategic way to reach an audience that at that time was probably mostly young adults, mostly white, but not exclusively. EC had a lot of Black readers and women and girls too, but you know, entirely different worlds from the kind of folks who are having the really important conversations during the 50s about civil rights. So I talk about those comics in the book, and you know, it was a really exciting project to explore and to be able to produce. I had a lot of fun with it.
And I think that just speaks to the power of comics because that's something new I just learned. I didn't know they had comic books that there were Black creatives at that time, like Jackie Orms,
That's right.
who what's the word I'm looking for? Who blended social commentary with art and cartoons.
That's
I didn't
right.
realize though that comic book, what was the creator? What was the publisher's name? E
EC Comics.
EC
So and
Comics.
the
I
E
didn't
stood
realize.
for entertaining comics.
Yeah, I didn't realize. I didn't. That's just something new to me. I didn't even know they existed until now. But I am familiar with their products, like Tales from the Crypt. I mean,
That's
everybody
right.
saw Tales from the Crypt on HBO
That's right.
when they were little. So, but it just speak those readers. You said it was a blend of white, Black, and probably other cultures that read these stories, and no doubt it did shape the way they saw themselves and the world around them, which probably led to some of the changes, such as the civil rights movement.
Right.
So it does speak to the power of comic books and how it's a
Mhm.
more palatable form of social protest in some cases. So thank you for aligning that for me Ebony knew this already, but for me, and just kind of bringing this into a clear focus for people like me who don't have the PhDs and the Eisner awards, but it just speaks to um, how much comic books resonates with all of us. It doesn't matter, who we are, the awards we've won, the titles we have behind our names. It resonates with everyone.
That's
And then
right.
thank goodness for people like you who have elevated the way comic books are looked at in our culture. And now, as you said before we started recording, now we see people getting grants and funding for curating projects, that are comic book centered. So thank you for that. So this is a fun question, Ebony. Ebony, this is a question Ebony came up with, because it's not. This is kind of years away from our typical interview. But
Okay.
what is your favorite comic book and why?
Well, I mentioned already Swamp Thing, and I'm gonna fudge this question a little bit because I will say that most comics that take place in the South in a swamp that are and involve monsters is going to be one of my favorite comics. And surprisingly, there's not just one, there's many. Along with Swamp Thing, I'm a big fan of it's a little bit older now, but Jeremy Love's Bayou, another Southern swamp monster. Um, Sophie Campbell's Wet Moon, also Southern swamps. Those are the kind of things that are just like guilty pleasure, fun readings, and I have found ways to work it into my academic work too. I love those types of comics. I will say this past year, I'm looking at my shelf here, had an opportunity to read this book, which I've mentioned to Ebony many times and it's been nominated and won many awards as well. The Talk was really good. I loved it. Um, these are a lot more, see, now I'm just rambling in terms of all the comics that I like.
That's all right.
This one as well. This one is a bio of Angela Davis that did some really interesting things. And so, I mean, I like all types. I'm a big fan of Miles Morales and all that. But those types of stories they're doing some experimental things and innovative things visually, and they're telling stories that we haven't quite seen that way in comics before. So yeah, maybe that's my more academic side, things like this. But for fun, I'm reading Southern horror comics.
Yes.
Yeah,
Bring on the horror. But I'm with you. I checked out The Talk from the library earlier this year. I have 3 Black sons, and so I was showing my husband, I was like, look at this, and he hadn't heard of it either. And so because you mentioned it in the comic book club, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to go and get this. And it's something
Really
sad that
good.
we have to think about. But like you said, to see it in a comic book or graphic novel form. I like that you mentioned that, because even what they did with the graphic history of like hip hop, I think there's one of like the Black Panther Party now. And so
Right.
it's nice, like you said, it's making these stories, these very historic, not even just historically important, but contemporarily important topics more palatable and I think easier to discuss. But like you said, the fact that they've always been doing that, when you go back to, like you said, EC Comics in the 1950s, and the fact that we were drawn appropriately and we weren't the monster.
Right. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I mean, I feel like there could probably just be a class on just the preachies. I don't know. Do you have a class just on the preachies?
Well, I do teach a class on it's called Race, Gender, and Graphic Novels. And you can only do the preachies and those comics for so long. And then the students are like, well, but what about Luke Cage? And so we do a little bit of everything in there.
that would be okay. This is great, but
What
Let's
about Luna? What about
there we go. Yes.
Nice. So I guess our final question, what advice do you have for our listeners who want to learn more about comic studies or even just academics? who want to integrate comics into their existing curriculum and develop future syllabi?
So that's a great question. And I think the first bit of advice I have is that you can bring comics into any class without yourself having been a longtime comics fan or, being an expert publishing books in comic studies. There's so much good material out there that can help you to incorporate these stories into your class. I think I've run into colleagues who they're a little anxious about sort of doing it the right way. And I'm just like I'm not a film studies scholar, so I try to make sure I do my homework if I bring a film into my class. There's some really good books. My colleague Rebecca Wanzo has an amazing book on race and caricature in comics. There's other things, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. Do a little bit of homework, and then any of these books can work alongside what you're already doing. Um, I think one of the great things about comics, obviously, students are going to sit up at attention when they hear you maybe bringing in a graphic novel or something like that. But like you all, they are then often surprised, hopefully pleasantly so, when they see all of the different range of topics that can be explored and that can be part of these stories. So even if it's the one, I would encourage people to bring it into their class and incorporate it into their syllabi. And I think the last thing I would say is for those who might choose to bring in comics is not to forget that it's a visual form. It's pictures as well as words. And, I've talked a lot about these stories, but because I am initially trained as a lit person, I try to make special point to say, let's really talk about how this story is told through the artwork, through the layout, through the design, through the color, and not forget the work of the artist, the letterer, the colorist, and those types of things as well. It's surprisingly easy, shouldn't be so easy for people to talk about a comic and never mention the art. So I always remind my students, you have to talk about how the art is also telling this
Mhm.
story. So those are some of my tips there for how to do it. But yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us a little bit about your perspective and your contributions to this space. It really does validate my experience in this space, and I'm looking forward to reading your essay. I don't know if that's the right word. Your essay in Desegregating Comics, as well as your other book called um, EC Comics, Race Shock and Social Protest. So I'm looking forward to that. I know I have the desegregating comics in my Amazon cart. And where can we find EC Comics, Race Shock, and Social Protest?
They are both on Amazon. They're both published by Rutgers University Press. And Desegregating Comics deals with the same period as EC, but it just looks more at Black creators and Black comics during that same time. So both, yeah, both are on Amazon.
Okay. And are you on social media?
I am on Twitter or X at just Qiana Whitted. So you can
Okay.
find me here.
You gotta
Yep.
come over to Threads, girl. Come over to
Mhm. Come
Threads and
on,
Meta.
Oh, see, I'm barely hanging on the one that I'm on.
Well,
Is there
thank you
anything we
again.
didn't get to that you wanted to say or share? So,
No, I don't think so. I've already plugged the cool things that I've read for this year. Um, yeah, I will just say thank you both for doing this podcast and for sort of shedding a light on especially women creators. I saw the interview with Aletha Martinez that you guys did, And congratulations on your nomination, your award nomination.
Oh, thank you. Yes. We
Yeah.
gonna be talking about it, girls, and we come back on in a couple of minutes. Yeah, we were nominated for a CBC award, so we are very grateful. And we're gonna be talking about that, Ebony,
Okay.
in a minute.
Yes, looking
But I
forward.
don't want to take anything away from you. This is your time. But again, we thank you so much for coming, and we hope to bring you back. And you're a friend of the podcast. So whenever you have something you want to share or talk about, you can definitely come back and blast it to the world.
Thank you. I'd love to do that. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mhm. All right. You have any final words, Ebony, for
I think that, I can go on and on and on, girl. I'm trying to be quiet. I just still want to say thank you, Qiana, because your essay, I know it was in the back matter of Bitterroot, but still that meant a lot to me to see Gullah, like the actual word, mentioned in a comic book. That was my first time. I'm like, people have, of course, borrowed from our folklore before, but to see it mentioned and for you to draw those like distinct to me obvious parallels and say the things. So even I thought we had elements of our culture even in Black Panther, but before I knew about Afrofuturism and all these things, I'm like, well, we got Sankofa, we got hoodoo, we got herbs, things. But to see you say this, well, this is Gullah folklore. So I'm like, thank you, English and African American studies,
Yes, got to shout out
literature
South
person
Carolina.
for pointing this out and broadcasting, hey, this is Gullah. Because even though I know the book, they are set between Mississippi and New York. I'm like, South Carolina, come on over to the Gullah East Coast. So
there you go.
yeah, so very motivating, very encouraging to see somebody mention. I got to the back of the book and I was like, finally, Gullah. Yes, this is Gullah.
Yes.
All right. Well, you take care. Have a beautiful rest of your day. I hope it's really nice where you are.
It is. I'm here and it's hot. Still
hot. I was about to say it's hot
in South Carolina.
All right. You take care of yourself. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you soon, Q.
Bye.
Bye-bye.